Hello, today in history we're going to discuss ancient Mesopotamia. Ancient Mesopotamia refers to a place where humans first formed civilizations. It was here that people first gathered in large cities, they learned how to write, and they also created governments. For this reason, Mesopotamia is also called the cradle of civilization. Right here in the map you would notice a green area right here, which would be considered Mesopotamia. Notice one river right here, the Tigris, and the second river right here, Euphrates. That is important because the word Mesopotamia means the land between rivers. When people say Mesopotamia, they are referring to a section of land in the Middle East between and around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Today this land is located mostly in the country of Iraq. There are also portions of southwestern Iran, southeastern Turkey, and northeastern Syria. The heart of Mesopotamia lies between the two rivers in southern Iraq. The land there is fertile, and there is plenty of water around the two major rivers to allow for irrigation and farming. Early settlers started together in small villages and towns. As they learned how to irrigate land and grow crop on large farms, the towns grew bigger. Eventually, these towns became large cities. New inventions such as government and writing were formed to help keep order in the cities. The first human civilization was formed. What started out as a small village grew into the civilization. Sumer. The Sumerians were the first humans to form civilization. They invented writing and government. They also organized in city-states where each city had its own independent government, ruled by a king that controlled the city and the surrounding farmland. Each city also had its own primary god. Sumerian writing, government, and culture would pave the way for future civilizations. Akkadians came next. They formed the first united empire where the city-states of the Sumer were united under one ruler. The Akkadian language replaced the Sumerian language during this time. It would be the main language throughout much of the history of Mesopotamia. Babylonians. The city of Babylon became the most powerful city in Mesopotamia. Throughout the history of the region, the Babylonians would rise and fall. At times, the Babylonians would create vast empires that ruled much of Middle East. The Babylonians were the first to write down and record their systems of the law. The Assyrians. The Assyrians came out of the northern part of Mesopotamia. They were a warrior society. They also ruled much of the Middle East at different times over the history of Mesopotamia. Much of what we know about the history of Mesopotamia comes from clay tablets found in Assyrian cities. Persians. The Persians put an end to the rule of the Assyrians and Babylonians. They conquered much of the Middle East, including Mesopotamia. Interesting facts of Mesopotamia. The Babylonian law created by King Hammurabi, the Code of Hammurabi, may be the oldest written law in the world. If many of y'all heard about the Code of Hammurabi, hand for a hand, eye for an eye. That's where those sayings came from. The Sumerians are often credited with inventing the wheel. At the center of each major city was a temple to the city's god called Ziggurat. The Tigris and the Euphrates rivers are both well over 1,000 miles long. Because this is where people first began to write, Mesopotamia is often called the place where history began. Mesopotamia is part of a larger area that archaeologists call the Fertile Crescent. Many of the buildings, walls, and structures were made from sun-dried bricks. These bricks didn't last very long, so very little ancient Mesopotamian cities still stand. Much of what we know about Mesopotamian history comes from thousands of clay tablets found in the library at the Assyrian city of Nineveh. Timeline. Ancient Mesopotamia is called the cradle of civilization. The first cities and empires were formed here. In 5000 BC, the Sumer, which we talked about, all these cities we have talked about. we're just going to go over a timeline of how long they lasted. The Sumer formed the first towns and cities. They used irrigation to farm large areas of land. Then 1,000 years later, the Sumer established powerful city-states, building large ziggurats at the center of their cities as temples to their gods. 3500 BC, much of the lower Mesopotamia is inhabited by numerous Sumer cities such as Uruk, Idra, Kish, Lagash, and Nippur. The Sumerians invented the first writing in 3300 BC. That's when the first writing was invented. They used picture for words and inscribed them on clay tablets. 3200 BC, the Sumerians began to use the wheel on vehicles. 3000 BC, Sumerians start to implement mathematics using a number system with a base of 60. 2700 BC, the famous Sumerian king Gilgamesh rules the city-state of Ur. 2400 BC, the Sumerian language is replaced by the Akkadian language as a primary spoken language of Mesopotamia. Sargon I of the first of the Akkadians conquered most of the Sumerian cities and creates the world's first empire, the Akkadian Empire. That was in 2330 BC. 2250, King Naram-Sin of Akkadians expanded the empire to its largest state. He will rule for 50 years. By 2100 BC, after the Akkadian Empire crumbles, the Sumerians once again gain power. The city of Ur is rebuilt. 100 years later, in 2000 BC, the Elamites capture Ur. 1900 BC, the Assyrians rise to power in northern Mesopotamia. 1792 BC, Hammurabi becomes king of Babylon. He established the code of Hammurabi, and Babylon soon takes over much of Mesopotamia. 1781 BC, King Shamshi Adad of Assyrians died. The first Assyrian empire is soon taken over by the Babylonians. 1750 BC, Hammurabi dies, and the first Babylon empire begins to fall apart. 1595 BC, the Kassites take the city of Babylon. 1360 BC, the Assyrians again rise to power. 1250 BC, the Assyrians begin to use iron weapons and chariots. 1225 BC, Assyrians capture Babylon. 1115 BC, the Second Assyrian Empire reaches its peak under the rule of King Tiglath-Pileser I. 1077, he dies, and the Assyrian Empire becomes weaker for a time. But 744 BC, the Assyrian Empire becomes strong once again under the rule of Tiglath-Pileser III. King Sargon II takes control of Syria. The empire grows stronger in 721. 709 BC, Sargon takes control of the city of Babylon. 705 BC, Sargon dies, and Sennacherib becomes king. He moved the capital to Nineveh. Try to get this. There we go. 668 BC, Ashurbanipal becomes the last great king of Assyria. He establishes a great library in the city in Nineveh. 626 BC, Ashurbanipal dies and Assyria begins to crumble. 616 BC, Nabopolassar takes control of Babylon back from the Assyrian and crowns himself king. The Neo-Babylonian Empire begins. 604 BC, Nabopolassar dies. Nebuchadnezzar II becomes king of Babylon. He will rule for 43 years and bring in Babylonian Empire to its peak. 550 BC, Cyrus the Great rises to power and the Persian Empire begins. 11 years later, Cyrus the Great takes the city of Babylon and lets the Jewish people return to Israel. 522 BC, Darius the First becomes king of Persia. He expands the empire and divides it up into states, each ruled by a governor called a satrap. Darius the First establishes the capital of Persian Empire as Persepolis in 518 BC. 490 BC, Darius attacks the Greeks. He is defeated at the Battle of Marathon. 480 BC, Xerxes first tries to conquer the Greeks with a huge army. He's eventually turned back in defeat. 333 BC, Alexander the Great invades the land and conquers the Persian Empire. Interesting fact right here, this is where you get a marathon from. When he attacked the Greeks, somebody ran from Marathon to, I don't know exactly where the capital of Greek was, but he ran what is equivalent as a marathon, and that's where you get the marathon from because of this battle. So that ends when Alexander the Great invaded and conquered it. That ended the Persian Empire. So as you can see, from 333 BC all the way in the beginning, which is 5000 BC, it has a long history of the kings and empires taking over different areas of Mesopotamia. It has a long ancient history.